Hi, everyone. My name is Omar Aziz. I am the director for the Middle Eastern Student Center at the University of California, Riverside. We are so thankful and grateful to have you all join us today for our third day of the Afghanistan Symposium 20 years later. We are just one day away from the 20th anniversary of when the United States first entered into Afghanistan. So we have taken this past week to explore some of the issues and some more background onto the conflict, onto Afghanistan, and to the Afghan people. And so we started on Monday with the history of the country and looking at how the history of Afghanistan has shaped what we see today and the conflict that started in 2001. On Tuesday, We dived into the culture and the media of Afghanistan and looking at its history, but also looking at how it's changed and shaped the culture and society, especially within these last 2 decades. And today, on the third day, we have been exploring the impacts of the US occupation of Afghanistan for the past 20 years. So we were very grateful to have Dr. Nura Sediqe interviewing Azmat Khan, journalist and professor, to talk about what they've seen in the last 20 years and their work and their reporting from Afghanistan. And so it was pre-recorded because Azmat Khan was actually in Afghanistan, and then because of her travel schedule and because of that, she will not be joining us tonight for the panel. However, we have such an incredible group of individuals that I'm very excited to introduce you all to. But before we do that, I just want to make sure that everyone who is watching and has been watching for the past few days, we encourage you all to use the hashtags that we've been trying to promote this week's event, and to place any feedback or comments and opinions from this week or interesting things you've learned using the hashtag UCR AFG hashtag and AFG Symposium on social media. Please feel free to use those and tag at MESC UCR for anything that related to this week's symposium. And once again, we are the Middle Eastern Student Center. We are an identity-based center, student support resource center at the University of California, Riverside, where we particularly serve Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian, North African, or SWANA students on our campus. So I'm so thrilled for today's speakers, and I wanted to one more thing before we get started in introducing them. I wanted to make sure that you all are also aware that we have these incredible folks here today, but we want to have more people coming to our universities and schools and institutions. And so I wanted to also share that we have a crowdfunding campaign going on with the UCR Scholar at Risk program that is looking to bring folks from Afghanistan to conduct research, to be students at UC Riverside. So please consider donating. Check out the link that we will be sharing. We are, many of us are able to study in the United States and do these things here, and we want to bring some folks who would like to come to the U.S. for their studies and continue their education, have the ability to do so. So we are encouraging folks to donate to this fundraiser and help us bring those folks here to continue their education and educate us and help us in learning more from them as well. So I will go ahead and begin to introduce our wonderful panel. So I'll go ahead and start with Dr. Nura Sediqe, who is our moderator for tonight's panel. So Nura is a postdoctoral research fellow and lecturer at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. She is also an assistant professor in political science at Michigan State University. Her major research endeavor involves Muslims in the United States and how a faith-based community with transnational linkages with political contexts like Afghanistan reconcile the prior social context with the current American political climate. Welcome, Dr. Sediqe. Then we have Mariam Jalalzada, who is an Afghanistan reconstruction expert. Mariam Jan has more than a decade of experience working with U.S. and international organizations focusing on reconstruction in Afghanistan. She left Kabul during the Civil War in 1994, spent a decade in Pakistan as a refugee, and ultimately moved to the U.S. in 2005. In 2012, after receiving her master's degree in international development from the Fletcher School, Mariam traveled back to Kabul, where she spent 3 years implementing and evaluating reconstruction efforts. She's traveled across the country extensively and observed how communities struggle to sustain their livelihoods and repair their relationships, all shattered by war. And last, we have Dr. Qais Munhazim from Jefferson University. Dr. Munhazim is a genderqueer, Afghan Muslim, and perpetually displaced, and is an assistant professor of global studies at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. Dr. Munhazim was born and raised in Kabul, Afghanistan. As an interdisciplinary scholar, decolonial ethnographer, and community activist, Munhazim's work troubles borders of academia, activism, and art while exploring everyday experiences of displacement and war in the lives of Afghans and Afghanistan and its diasporas. So I'm very excited to hear from tonight's amazing panel and thankful to all of you for taking the time to join us and share your knowledge and wisdom for those of us. So I will go ahead and pass off the mic to Nura Jan, and I look forward to hearing from you all.
Great. Thanks so much, Omar, for the kind introductions. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this conversation with two people that I have such deep respect and admiration for, and I'm privileged to say that I have personal relationships with both of you. So for those who don't speak Dari, I'm going to refer to them as Qais John and Mariam John, which is sort of a term of endearment. And so in that way, it helps me feel comfortable to sort of let you in on their expertise in a way that I can engage with both of them. And so thank you both so much for being with us for this conversation. And really what we wanted to focus in on is the impacts of the occupation. And you both bring such distinct experiences, both from your professional work and your personal insight. I remember meeting Mariam John in Boston, and it was really one of my first encounters with Afghans outside of my realm of Fremont, California, and my family. And with Qais John, similarly, I know you just were in Kabul, and we've talked about, and I think I was messaging you when you were in Kabul about some of the insights. Yeah, I felt like I had a personal window in because you would share some of the visuals and videos of your footage on some of your social media platforms, and you would kindly engage when I had questions. So what I might do is, Qais John, if you don't mind, I might start with you and say, as I mentioned, you were recently in Kabul with family, and you were also doing ethnographic work. And I wanted to see if there are some takeaways you wanted to share with us to begin the conversation.
Thank you so much, Nura Jan, and I'm very, very happy to share this platform also with Mariam Jan, that I'm a great fond of your work in Afghanistan. This is a very important panel because we are sitting here 20 years later with the same violence, with a different players on the ground. And I also want to take this opportunity to send love to those who are in Afghanistan under the violence of Taliban and who also endured 20 years of the violence of the US invasion, international invasion, and occupation. In the meantime, I also want to send love and remember those who have left home in the past few weeks. They have lost their homes. They are either at some borders right now waiting to be resettled somewhere else, or they're in refugee camps. They have left their homes and dreams and futures behind. And just like us, they have been displaced. This is another round of Afghan displacements, and I don't know how many more we will have. I want to share some of my work in relation to gender, particularly in Afghanistan, because my work engages with gender and sexuality in Afghanistan, but also particularly in relation to the war in Afghanistan, and it's also displacements and waves of refugees leaving Afghanistan and settling in other countries. Particularly, I'm interested in the ways that the international community have used gender as an argument to also invade Afghanistan, to sustain the violence, but it is to fund the war. But at the same time, now that they have left, we also see the impact of the war and this abrupt leaving and abandonment also on gender in multiple folds, particularly on the lives of women, non-binary folks, and queer and trans Afghans. And when we go back to the representation of Afghanistan and how the very gendered representation of Afghanistan have actually justified the military occupation and 20 years of the war, it's not surprising to see how the words in many ways have depicted the Afghan women as devoutly loveless and perpetually oppressed by the Afghan man, but at the same time, the Afghan man moves between these categories of hyper toxic masculine, at the same time weak. And within those depictions, the non-binary Afghan, queer Afghans always remain invisible, but yet also hyper visible when the international community wants to use this community in order to put attention on Afghanistan and also claim the freedom that they have brought, and also cover up the war and violence in different ways. That even now there is conversation on queer and trans Afghans stuck under Taliban, but there's no conversation how their lives were before coming of the Taliban. And it wasn't that their lives were any better. It's just that now people are trying to write about it, and in a way to frame queer and trans as this completely oppressed community that the US had in a way saved, and now they are left for Taliban. So I'm going to share my screen to take you through a visual journey to Afghanistan and the landscape of war in Afghanistan from a gendered lens, because gender is very, very important in my work. And I want to, and in this particular work, I also see the landscape of war through a gender and at the same time through a queer lens, and how people live in the war through these very gendered realities. Flowers, Love, and the Landscape of Violence, Queering War in Afghanistan. Here I want your attention to the flowers. As Afghans, we all know how flowers are so close to us. We have always grown up with parents who had flowers at home in the yard. And these 5 flowers you see, I have taken their pictures from my own father's garden in Afghanistan when I was there this past summer. These flowers became very, very important to me because I remember my early days in Afghanistan as my dad would water these flowers, and I would walk behind him and trying to read my poetry, which was very, very queer at a very young age. And my father would listen to those poetry and would take me around the flowers and talk about flowers, and continuously would, in a way, also compare me to flowers. And when I look at it now, it was such a queer way of parenting, which is very absent in the West, but also it's very absent in the way that the West depicts Afghan fathers, because in the depiction of the West, Afghan fathers have always remained militant, have always remained hyper-masculine. However, we all know how Afghan fathers have in so many ways embraced femininity that are part of our Afghanness. This is the garden that I'm talking about, our yard in Afghanistan, which was also then bombed and also rocketed a couple of times. I lost my aunt and many cousins in the same spot where these flowers are growing today. I'm taking you to this visual queer landscape of Afghanistan. The picture in the background you see is the King's Palace in Afghanistan in Darlaman's Palace, which I took 10 years ago, 2011. And these 2 people you see in the front, a picture that I just took this past summer, Rahim and Sohrab. These 2 people I met during my research. They both are students at one of the private universities in Kabul studying medicine. One is from Helmand, one is from Logar. And interestingly, they both are men who live together, and they tell people that they live as cousins because that's easier. And they both laugh about it, that nobody knows we are actually lovers. People treat us like we are cousins. And Rahim tells me that if it wasn't for Sohrab, I would have already left Kabul, because this kind of love, this kind of friendship has continuously made the war easier for me to stay behind and continue with my dreams. Unfortunately, now, as we are speaking, they're both separated. One is living in a safe house in a different country, and one is still in Kabul waiting for evacuations. Layla and Karim, these are two lawyers who actually met in Afghanistan while they were working together, but also they fell in love when they went on an official trip to free prisoners, Afghan prisoners in Iran. And it's interesting because Layla tells me that when she worked in Afghanistan and lived and also ran a home, her father's family, people never thought that Layla would get married, or the joke was that she would always end up living maybe with one of her female friends. However, Layla said that when they went on this trip, she proposed to Karim, and then they got engaged and got married, and they still spend every single day together. And the conversation between them also, when I was talking to them, was in a way that they have both escaped 3 suicide bombings in Kabul, and that has also made them not to leave each other's side, because in their love, I saw that they want to be together forever. And Layla laughed that I don't think I want to die before Karim, or Karim wants to die before me. And these sort of stories of love and survival are oftentimes absent in the conversations on Afghan war and the impact of war. We see, and also the sort of love that also even men have in this in the context of war. This is an anonymous person who wanted to remain anonymous. I met her during my work and interviewed her, spent time with her. She survived also 3 suicide bombings. In one of them, she also got heavily injured. And for her, her love is this work, that the work that she comes into as a lawyer and spends a lot of time working on women's rights and a lot of the treaties between different countries on international women's rights. I'm every time I look at this picture, it makes me cry, because I know that she has lost this job. She's not there anymore because none of these women are allowed to come back to work under Taliban. This is Nargis and Marjan, 2 friends who met at one of the universities, and they would actually take night classes. They would accompany each other to go to night classes together because of the security situation in Afghanistan. And oftentimes when we talk about the war, the 20 years, we forget that it had actually made life so difficult for women to be outside. It was not only the fear of suicide bombings, it was also fear of kidnapping, because people were also living in poverty. And these two, in a way, became each other's support. And they both graduated from law school, and now they both became breadwinners for their families. However, they have lost their jobs now. This is Fawad, Haya, Kian, and Azad, 4 queer people who met at a clandestine Facebook group, and then they took their friendship into the public space and would meet together for making art or just going on walks, bike riding. And also I spent time with them at a clandestine queer club in Kabul, where we would dance to Afghan music, smoke shisha, and drink green and black tea and talk about life. And these 4 also mentioned that the war in so many ways have also brought drugs with it, because we never talk about the drugs that exist in Afghanistan, the impact of the 20 years and the presence of drugs for young Afghans, particularly young men, who are continuously lured towards it because of the unemployment rate and also because of the violence that exists in the country. So these 4 were telling me that the one reason they want to see each other together and support is because they don't want one of them to also get into drugs. However, they have been separated now in the past few weeks. And these are Jamil and Ratib. Jamil and Ratib were 2, again, lovers that I met in Kabul. In different ways, they both were artists, and they would paint the murals on the walls of Kabul. That's where they met, and that's where I went and talked to them at the beginning, and then they also became my guide. However, right now, one is living in a refugee camp in Albania, and the other one is living in a safe house outside Kabul. And these are Salim, Nawab, and Muhammad, three friends that I would always encounter in Sharanao in Kabul whenever I would go with my friends or to shop or to do run errands. They would always be sitting there drinking tea and offering me tea. But also they would laugh with me, with my other queer friends, in the way that they would actually accept us and welcome us in their space. It was in subtle ways of telling us they knew we were queer, but at the same time, they were very cool with it. And then Salim, the one in white hair, would tell me that he's also never married, and in a way hinting me that he was also possibly queer. And it's interesting, the tank that you see on the right is the tank that I also grew up playing on. I remember it gave me the sense of masculinity because people would make fun of me for being very feminine. So this side of violence and war and the remittance of the tanks all around the city in Kabul and also other provinces, in a way also masculinized the landscape in war, and the impact of that on children, the impact of that on men who grew up with these violent visuals that also expected them to be in a certain masculine way to defend their home, to defend also their families. These are my own, actually, nephews who now grow playing on the same tank that I did and their fathers did. Now I'm going to take you to a different part of the question of gender. These are genderqueer, trans, non-binary Afghans who are now on the run. They haven't made it very far. However, these are the photos that they took and sent it to me because they are aware of my project. And I'm also supporting and helping them in during these evacuations. In the past few weeks, I have barely slept every night, and I'm continuously putting work to get them out. Some days I manage to make everything work, but then it falls apart because there are not so many of us who are working on queer and trans Afghan evacuations. As we know that the Afghan community in general, whether it's at home or in diaspora, not so much at home, but actually in the diaspora, is quite homophobic and transphobic. I tend to not talk about it because I also don't want to perpetuate that side or that sort of Islamophobia and xenophobia towards my community, but this is now we are among ourselves. We also are aware of how queer and trans people are continuously pushed aside or erased. So therefore, I want to bring that. I want to shove this on your faces that we exist and we will thrive, and you will see us much more in diasporic spaces as well in the future. This is one of their Hayat's, actually, I was telling you the story earlier, Hayat's bag. That's actually, she's on the run, but she may manage to get her makeup. And these are all some of the queer people who are actually in a safe house waiting for evacuations. And this is actually Rahim from the very first photo that you all saw, the two people who pretended to be cousins, who's sitting and watching a border while he's waiting for his flight out of Afghanistan. And it's important to think through these when we think about the impact of war and the kind of violence that it has brought in the lives of not only Afghan women, but Afghan men, but also queer and trans and non-binary Afghans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Qais. It gives me chills in some ways to see these visuals, because I think it really gives us insight and awareness in a way that does not, like you said, make the mainstream consciousness, whether it's in the Afghan diaspora, who, like you've said, are need to be held accountable for how they play a part in erasing these experiences to the general American public, right? And I wonder, so the tank stuck out to me as a moment, and so thinking about this reframing of how we've talked about this, I think, what are key takeaways that in terms of like this project, like what are things that are on your mind in terms of how you want this project to move forward, or ways you want audience members to engage with this?
So through this particular project, I also trace the impact, the gendered impact of war and displacement. As you can see, I tell stories, and the stories also are in so many ways stories of gender, stories of sexualities, stories of women, non-binary and queer and trans folks. But I'm also when I was doing this project, I wasn't aware what's going to happen in Afghanistan, because I recently just came from Afghanistan, and I was doing this as Taliban were taking over provinces. As some of them, I have very, very clear memory that I was taking some of them, and Kunduz was falling in the hands of Taliban, Mazar was falling in the hands of Taliban. And I wasn't thinking that this is going to be a longer term project. And now I am following these folks in where they will be. Either they're going to be in refugee camps, as you can see, or safe houses. So they are now taking the ownership of this project, because I don't want to be the sole owner of this project, but them, because they are the one who are telling the story. They are the one who are part of this visual and also being impacted directly by the war and violence. So they're sending me what they want the world to see through their experiences and lenses. But at the same time, the covering of the face and all of that is part of the saving their privacies. So my plan is to also continue in a way their journeys and see how displacement and violence of refugee life also is so gendered, and what that impact is also in their lives.
Thank you so much. I want to invite Mariam Jan into the conversation as well. Mariam Jan, you grew up in Kabul, I believe, right? I wanted to start with your personal account, maybe get your thoughts on what Qais John shared, and then transition into thoughts on, I know Qais had mentioned the pervasiveness of drugs, which gets me into the question of funding in the sort of the economic situation in Kabul and in Afghanistan, and what role that plays. But I wanted to turn to you if there's any thoughts of your personal accounts, having spent time there, and then transition to that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Qais John, for sharing those experiences and stories, personal stories that are, I'm sure, near to your heart. And it's not an easy topic to talk about. I think as you were talking, one thing I realized is like, it's probably not just true about Afghans, but in general, I feel like we're such a complicated, complex people, and in so many different ways. I feel like there's so many contradictions, there's so much complexity, there's so many different lived experiences, and so many lenses through which we can look at the last 20 years. And the way I was thinking about this is, there's a lot of negative things that you can talk about, but then I look at myself, and I had a different experience, because one, I am a product of that that sort of a mixture of like war and then peace and war. I'm a product of that in the sense where we had to flee the war at one point when I was really young. So I experienced it firsthand and how it felt, and then I had to flee and basically leave your childhood home, basically having no childhood. And then coming back to Kabul in 2004, it was a whole different experience after 10 years being away, not being able to go to to do my higher education in Pakistan because, for all sorts of reasons. But coming back to Kabul in 2004, I remember a sense of jubilation, excitement, hope, and so much passion. And it wasn't just that I saw it in myself, but I saw it in people around me. Where this was like everybody wanted to do something, everybody was engaged and active and proactive, and wanted to build this country or the city that had turned into rebel. Like it was really like. If you can think of like Berlin and London during the World War II, that's Kabul for you, and in 2001 or 2000 or 19, well, actually 94, 93, 94. That's when we left. So like people were building things physically and of course emotionally, and then as much as my entire professional career has been focusing on assessing foreign assistance, including the U.S., I also feel like there's been certain opportunities that were created, whether for good reason or bad reason. Let's not go into the politics of it, but there are opportunities created for people like me who was really keen to go to university, do higher education, and that was something that was completely impossible before 2000, or as a refugee in Pakistan. And that's what I could do when I came back in 2004. There were opportunities, and I was able to get a scholarship and travel to the US, study what I really wanted to study. So all I'm trying to say is that our lived experiences are very, very different, and everybody has their personal story. Everybody has seen the goods and the bads. As a woman, I have had my share of good and bad. It's not easy to live in Kabul, in Afghanistan. As a woman, you face a lot of discrimination. There's a lot of backlash, especially for someone who wants to do something about the country, about women, about development in general. There's always a lot of backlash. You are not encouraged to raise your voice. You're not encouraged to be proactive. You're not encouraged to be loud, but you kind of forge forward. So just being you is a form of activism. Like I wasn't an activist. I never was. I never considered myself an advocate. But just being a woman and trying to make space for yourself, that was part of our everyday life. That was part of our existence. But I do think that that space opened up a lot post 2001, 2002, and that did not exist, of course, during the Taliban years or before 2001, 2002. So that's just one aspect of it that I wanted to comment on. But then also at the same time, what I see right now is sort of like a déjà vu of what we had seen 24, 25 years ago. Where we are right now is what I feel like we are, where we were in 2000 or in 94, 95. The reason I'm saying that is the humanitarian crisis. Like that's the one thing that I really want to mention, and for all of us to remember that right now there are three main crises that's happening in Afghanistan. There's the humanitarian crisis that we all have been hearing about in terms of like poverty. There's about 90% of our population at the brink of starvation. 1 in 2 children are malnourished or about to starve. There's the financial crisis. The country is about to collapse. The banks are running out of cash. People are running out of cash. The assets are frozen. Foreign aid is not coming to the country anymore. And then there's the refugee crisis. And these are not new. We know that. This is not new. We have faced that 25 years ago. This is exactly what was happening. The country was at the brink of collapse. And that was 4 or 5 years after the Taliban had taken over. By 2000, the country had nothing. People were fleeing in millions, and that's what's happening right now. We've started seeing that right now. That's the similarities that I'm seeing in terms of like the events that are unfolding.
What about when it comes to funding? And so I was curious, as you mentioned, this pre and post 9/11 and the aid. Are you concerned about the aid stoppage? Is that contributing to the current economic crisis and sort of?
Yeah, definitely. So the other thing that's similar to pre 2000 to 2001 is that what was happening back then is, I'm going to specifically talk about the U.S., but I think it was across the board, the UN and other international organizations. What was happening that they did not recognize the government. They didn't want to recognize the Taliban. They didn't like the way they treated the population. So, but at the same time, they knew that the country is at the brink of a humanitarian crisis, and they wanted to do something. So there was some level of humanitarian funding that was going to the country. And even then, the US was the largest donor providing humanitarian aid, which is ironic because they did not want to talk to the Taliban. They had sanctions on them, but they wanted to help the people. So they were still sending humanitarian aid, but that was through a lot of UN agencies, international organizations, NGOs, both in Pakistan and inside Afghanistan. And that's what's happening right now. At least they were under some pressure to at least allow humanitarian aid. If you've frozen the assets and if you're not going to be providing funding to the government, at least, help the people. So they are doing that, and it's a much higher scale, actually. Just this 1 year, they've provided about like $300 million in humanitarian aid, which I think is, it's not a lot. It's not a lot. What the country needs is it's like quadruple more than what's been given by the US, but the other countries are providing aid as well. But the problem is that it's not just the humanitarian aid that the country needs. There's an entire infrastructure that depends on foreign aid. There's people, the civil service, government jobs, people are not getting their salaries. And that was one of the biggest employment source for a lot of people. NGOs, working for the NGOs was another huge employment source for people. People have lost their jobs, so people are not getting paid. Purchasing power has completely collapsed, and so that's something that's not going to be taken care of by humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is food, shelter, and emergency aid, healthcare. But in terms of like maintaining an infrastructure that was set up, as bad as it was, there is an infrastructure right now. There are services that were being provided, as bad as it was, and that needs money to be run. And Taliban don't have that money, and if they do, they don't even know how to run the government, and they're not going to be able to spend it in the right way. So the country, that infrastructure, it is going to collapse without foreign aid, and it's not humanitarian aid.
It's such an important point. I think we hear aid and we don't think of the distinction between humanitarian aid, and that when there's foreign aid, that's not just for humanitarian purposes. You're saying that foreign aid is the infrastructure. So the jobs that were like, so when you say jobs I understand. So there's like aid to NGOs. So what do you mean when you say there's foreign aid to like government jobs? What does that look like?
Like your teachers, your doctors. In Afghanistan, a lot of the social services was provided by the government. You don't have a huge private sector, right? Like schools. There was a growth of private schools and private healthcare facilities, but a lot of it was still funded by the government, and the government did not have its own money. So it was the World Bank and the IMF that gave them the money. It was the US and other international international donors, and that's what paid people. That's what paid teachers to teach and doctors to work, right? And a whole bunch of other sectors. Right. So that's the money that's frozen right now. That's the money that's not going to go to the government because of that rift between the international community or the West and the Taliban. They don't want to recognize a government that imposed itself on people, and rightly so. But the problem is that it's the people that are going to suffer.
And when you spoke about however bad it was, I think some people did have questions. And one of the things that came up, I interviewed Azmat Khan earlier about the aid, was that she gave accounts to contractors. Like she gave me an example of a school near Kandahar and how the contractor received the money, started the base, and then when she went to visit, the school wasn't built, and then the children were at the mosque studying, and it was mainly boys because there wasn't enough space. And then how pervasive, so even before this crisis, we were talking about the complexities of the US presence in Afghanistan. One of the complexities was, examples like this, where there was aid distributed, but then you have Azmat Khan's reporting indicating that they gave the money, they said the school is being built, and then she goes to do a site visit, and it's just like some construction material and nothing was actually built. Was that something, is that something that's a one-off, or is that something that was like a pervasive negative outcome from some of these situations?
No, that was pretty widespread. Pretty widespread in the sense that there were ghost, you've heard about ghost soldiers, ghost teachers, ghost schools. A lot of the things that were reported were not real, because what happens with the US funding, there's a lot of attention given to numbers. There's a lot of attention given to quantity than quality, and that has been an issue overall. There's just this obsession with showing success, short-term gains over long-term development, and talking about numbers. And you would see that, like, whenever government officials talk about it, it's always showing numbers and percentages to talk about the gains that have been made by Afghans, right? Like these many kids get to go to school, or these many women, just the numbers that they throw in. And there's a lot of caveats that need to be made there. But in general, there's got to be some balanced analysis, in the sense that if you look at it from a critical perspective, like there are a number of issues that plague not just the U.S. assistance, but in general foreign aid. And one is just the scale of the need, the magnitude. In 2001, 2002, everything had to be built from scratch, like physically. Right, and then the capacity on both ends, both on the Afghan side and on the west side. They didn't have the capacity to deliver, and the Afghans didn't have the capacity to absorb. This just like this influx of money.
Like almost like a shock of money that entered the system.
Yeah, and it's a lot to process. It takes a lot and a long time to be able to process that. So that was another thing that was pretty common across board. And then with foreign aid, there's this tendency of short-term planning. It's like a year by year, and that happens from the highest level, at the congressional level, where that's how they allocate money. That's another problem. And development in countries like Afghanistan happens over decades. Some changes require generational investment, right? And so a year by year funding and having a 2 to 3 year long program wouldn't change much. So that was another thing. And then corruption, as Azmat Khan has talked about it, everybody has been looked into quite extensively. That was another thing that ate a lot of the money, caused a lot of waste and fraud. And then on top of all of this, this was a country at war. Like the way the donor countries were operating as if this is a post-conflict country. And this was not. There was an intense conflict going on. So as much as you try to throw money at the problem, there were people who were dying, and there were people who were fighting, and there was a lot of conflict going on. So that's another thing that caused a lot of these programs that might have succeeded in a normal environment. And that to me is not just a problem with U.S. assistance. I see that in a lot of other donors as well. But here's the thing: despite all of those problems, because of the influx of the money and because of the tension and because of an exposure to the world outside and a lot of foreigners traveling to Afghanistan and a lot of NGOs getting these money and having to hire people to do the work, right? There were a lot of jobs that were created, a lot of spaces that were opened up for people to do things that they had never done. People started going to school at night, working during the day. A lot of people who had missed university because either they couldn't go during the Taliban or because they had to, or just there was no opportunity, they started doing that. Like in 2004, I remember a lot of my cousins, for instance, all of a sudden started going to night schools. There were no night classes before at a larger scale, right? So you would see that because of the improvement in the economic situation for a lot of families, they were able to afford to go to school, they were able to afford a better life, travel, a lot of the things that weren't possible. So there were good things that were happening, but the thing is, it was almost like a side effect of the influx of money. It wasn't really like the intangibles that's hard to measure, and it's something that donors don't track. That was happening at the time.
It almost feels like in some ways, I think with the U.S. occupation is like Afghans are not asking for. It's like we just need people not to be in our way to like live life in some ways. And in some ways, I have two questions, and this relates to both of you. One was, when it came to aid distribution, was there any focus of aid or earmarked in a way that would target to assist Afghans on the margin? So to Qais John's presentation on queer Afghans, like was there a way that like Afghans that have remained sort of silenced on the margins, there was aid that was like targeted towards that, or NGOs that worked on that? And I'm asking as someone who's like very unfamiliar, as a lay question. And then two, Mariam John, to your point on night schools and how opportunities, side effects. So that question's for you, Mariam John. And to Qais, Mariam John mentioned that one of the side effects were night schools and these different social spaces opening. And I wanted to see if you could speak on like what your participants or folks you collaborated with have said about what they thought the last 20 years looked like and what their fears are about the situation moving forward.
Just to answer your first question, there was, yes, an influx of aid in the country, but also there was corruption. There was corruption from the start, and the biggest corruption was also bringing in people who had no idea about Afghanistan, like Karzai. These were people who were outside Afghanistan for a long time, and like that, there were also people who came in as ministers, deputy ministers from the diaspora, and people who had left Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was only in their lives through BBC and CNN, and that was it. And so that's why there was a lot of like misuse of also the funds. And when it comes to any allocations of funds for in terms of gender, yes, there was a lot of focus on gender, and just like as the invasion happened in terms of the saving Afghan women from Afghan men, as Laila would argue. And so there was a lot of flow of money into gender projects, but they were also very short term. They were not thinking about the future. They were not thinking about school. If they were thinking about school, it was also the number of school, as Mariam was saying. It was not how it's going to impact the women in long term. And so they had, for example, humanitarian aid for widows in bakeries. And these were widows who should have been also independent, right, through this aid. However, this aid made them much more dependent. And that was another gendered impact of the humanitarian aid that continuously, it also in a way divided, because the word gender doesn't even exist in Farsi. we just made up jinsiyat in the past few years. And so that also in a way made a drift between Afghan men and women. Those who are doing gender projects were not seen as the right kind of women anymore. And so there was a lot of push towards that. And so there was also this like, and men also felt they were being betrayed. And so there was a lot of the funds that were going to those projects were also taken out of the country by a lot of gender experts who were coming from outside and taking a big chunk of that as salaries, or there were conferences outside the country. So it wasn't like maintaining, working towards any gender equity in the country. But also when we think about queer and trans people, no, there was no work towards queer and trans people, because they were continuously trying to so-called, what they would say, speak to the sensitivities of Afghanistan, while Afghan sensitivities are always aware of queerness in the country and transness in the country. We have always been there. However, the aid never targeted our communities in no way. And so that really impacted the poverty level of queer and trans people, even employment. They were unemployed in many places. Dropout rate was high because they would get bullied because those sense of education in these institutions on issues of gender equity or even queer and trans. But also what to the last question, what my interlocutors or comrades, the people that I actually spend time with, told me about the impact. We tend to talk now a lot about what's happening on queer and trans people since the Taliban, but their lives weren't any better even before to speak of, because they didn't have any safe spaces to get together or gather or have any safety. There was also no work done by the international community in order to mainstream queer and trans issues. And the only difference between that and now is that now actively Taliban are going after trans and queer people to arrest them and to kill them. Previously, that wasn't the case. So the government wasn't going actively after queer and trans people to kill them. However, the violence was always there.
Mm-hmm.
But Mariam Jalalzada, did you want to comment on Qais Jan's reflections? Or?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I also feel like the way, especially women, the emphasis was so much on women, and the way women were sensationalized to attract attention and funding and justify all sorts of things. I always felt very uncomfortable about that. One, because it takes away the agency from women and present them as victims, and like this sense of pity, which is very not true at all. Like if you go to some of these villages and you talk to some of these families, you don't see a lot of women out in the public, but they have a lot of agency within their families. There are matriarchs in Kandahar. There are matriarchs in some of the most conservative villages and provinces. You have these women who have a lot of say and power and authority and influence within their clan or household. But the way they do it, it's very subtle and discreet, because they're very smart. They know how to navigate this very patriarchal, conservative landscape. What some of the foreign interventions did was to force women to come out into the public's eye and kind of celebrated that sort of outspokenness, and turned them into celebrities. So this cause that was supposed to be to help women actually hurt them. In my personal opinion, I feel like this too much attention to women actually hurt them. There has been research done that women in the parliament, the ones who have been the most successful are the ones who work behind the scene, who work with others, and that they're not really outspoken inside the parliament. They don't go on the floor and they don't scream, or because they know that they're facing a very strong resistant sort of group. So what they do, they get a lot of their things resolved through backdoor diplomacy. and I think that has worked for a lot of women. But when you try to put them out there and then you kind of encourage them and force them and incentivize that sort of like having to be loud to be noticed, and that's what the U.S. specifically was rewarding, and then they created a group of people and then they rewarded them in a way, and then kind of stayed connected to that one very small group of people, and that sort of dictated the direction of how they're gonna support women, and that was very problematic, and that's why I feel, I don't know if you've heard or saw this one interview with Mahbouba Siraj, who's a really, really amazing Afghan women activist, a feminist, and who's been in Afghanistan for a long, long period of time, and she still is there. And one of the questions that somebody asked her, like, how do you feel about all of this? You know, the U.S. has withdrawn, the Taliban has come back. The question was, how do you feel about the U.S. withdrawal? And she was like, I feel relieved. And you know, the reporter was stunned. Like, it's the reaction of the reporter was more interesting to me. That, like, why would you expect something else? Because that's what we're used to. We have to be, oh my God, we need the U.S. The U.S. has to be there because that's the savior. That's the kind of narrative that's been sold, right? So when she said that I'm relieved, and then she elaborated on it, you know, it made a lot of sense, because women would, according to like what she was trying to say, is that there's a space now where women can have their own agency and push for their own agenda and their own terms and at their own pace. There's not that sort of rushed and forced sort of push that, you know, you have to do this or you have to do it that way. So I know that it's a very controversial stance to have, what she has been saying, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of people share that sort of mentality where we didn't have an organic activism for women's rights. It was something that was pretty much imposed or superficial, I would say. And I don't know if we have the space now to do anything. Honestly, in my personal opinion, I don't think the Taliban being there and the US gone, there's a lot of space for women to operate. But we'll, at least there's an argument to be made there that compared to the past, that a lot of people have been arguing that, you know, that where are those women that the US empowered right now? The women who are raising their voice and going on the street are not the ones who were made or who are the beneficiaries of the US projects. That's what the criticism is.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to see that those women also have been just immediately evacuated, right? It was as if like it was part of that project of like, I'm making you, but I can also remove you from the space that I want to.
I think that's such an important dynamic that people don't think about in this conversation around gender and women, is exactly this point. Is it's almost like these opposite extremes of direct harm. It's a different type of harm when there's this escalation of this is what we expect of you as women from the US occupation to like this, the violence that might come at the hands of the Taliban. And then you're both complicating these notions that, as honestly, as you both said, is I grew up as a diaspora kid. I grew up in Kuwait in the US. I've never been to Afghanistan, and the women in my family have a very specific experience of Kabul. I have family in Herat, but they've always been different when it came to women's roles than my family in Kabul. And I think in some ways they had the Kabul of the 1960s and 70s they had is what they want now, but they're not the ones living there now. So it's a very weird, interesting discussion of like, well, you're not there, so why do you expect a certain thing of women in a city that you didn't go back to, right? And so I think there's an interesting tension again of who is there and collaborating on this, and like you said, who had the opportunity to leave, and who is stuck with the consequences right now, right? We're near time, and I wanted to transition to final thoughts. What are your hopes for the future of Afghanistan? I think it's very early to ask. I think on many levels, there's a lot of trauma and emotion of the last few months. But is there anything that gives you hope going forward, or any thoughts you have for the future, what you can dream of, or are those things that are hard to sort of tangibly think about given the current situation we're in?
I mean, for me, when I look at it, the hope is in Afghanistan. It's with those women on the streets. It's with those queer and trans people who are staying also behind. Because a lot of times we tend to think that the hope is somewhere in the West, in the diaspora. That hope was never here, because we saw that in the 20 years, there were a lot of diaspora engagements within Afghanistan here and there, but they also knew that they can leave whenever they want to. So I think the building of Afghanistan, the hope, the dream is still in Afghanistan. It's the generation that would actually make it. Because when I was in Afghanistan this summer, I saw how much the people, the young generation, have actually worked in Afghanistan and built it. It wasn't in the foreign aid. It wasn't in the humanitarian aid. It was in every single Afghan's dream to make Afghanistan. And that was something that it really like pushed him forward. And I think that still exists there. And when we say that, oh, I've lost hope for Afghanistan, it usually comes from a very privileged place when we are sitting here and making those remarks, because these millions of people are still there. So let them dream, and we will support them in that dream.
Thank you.
Really, really well said, because I was about to say this. I don't think I have a lot of hope. And I don't think it comes from a place of privilege. I think it comes from a place of a recognition in what's happening. Like in the last 20 years, what we had built, the kind of people that this generation of people, like the people who are leaving right now, a lot of them were the kind of people you wanted to stay and build the country, right? Like that, those are the people who had the experience, the passion, and a lot of them probably didn't even want to leave. You know, they had amazing, like they had jobs, they had stuff going well for them in certain ways. Like I've talked to people. I was at the Philly airport helping with the arriving Afghans, and not everyone was really happy that they've come to the U.S. You know, there was this one woman. She was like, I had an amazing home-based food business. And she was like, we had started scaling it up, and we had a Facebook page, and I was getting a lot of orders, and then I had to get out and leave, and my entire business collapsed. And you see teachers like that, where like, you know, it's just, so the stories there are like a variety of stories that you hear from people, and there's not always a lot of excitement that, oh my God, I made it to the US and I'm so happy. What really breaks my heart is that an entire population of educated and experienced group of people have left the country, and there's more of them are going to leave in the near future. I don't know, I can't think of a different scenario than what I saw in 93, 94. It's really hard for me to see anything differently, because when the Taliban came to power in 95, 96, that's when you know, we started going downhill. And by 2000, there was basically nothing functioning in the country. And it's really hard for me to see it end in any other way, unless I don't know, it takes a miracle. A lot of people say that the Taliban have changed, and they will learn how to govern. They might not be as oppressive. It's really hard for me to believe that. And also, there is part of it comes from privilege, because I'm not in Kabul right now. I'm not living there. I don't have a lot of stakes in the city, right? And having to live there is very different from when you're outside. It's easy for me to be like, oh, well, I don't know, there's no hope for this country. That's what we always say. But as Qais said, there are people who are living there. The women, the girls, they're like, we want to go to school. I want to become a doctor, and I want them to let me go to school. So everybody you ask would have a different perspective based on their background, based on where they are in their life, based on their geography. So people from Kabul would have a different perspective. Someone from a village would have a different perspective. And that's another thing that's missing in this discourse, that we don't have that sort of a diverse understanding. We just hear from people who are the loudest, and usually the people who are the loudest are the people who have the connection and that sort of exposure. And that's usually comes from Kabul, and that's not representative of the entire country. So just to summarize, I am hopeful, but just tiny little bit.
It's hard, my family in Herat, they didn't ever want to leave because they work with the land. They've grown grapes, and this is their point of pride. And now you're seeing a variation of reaction in a way that they're like, we survived Taliban the first time, but in a way that they didn't think they'd have to again. And now they're reconciling this connection of preserving what they feel like has been their legacy there, and whether that's worth staying for or not. And so there's a lot of mixed emotions and complexities and dynamics right now with the thoughts there. One of the things that gives me hope is your work, Qais John, and your work, Mariam John. And I think in a lot of ways we can't let Afghanistan leave the public imaginary of people in the United States who've directly been invested in Afghanistan as taxpayers over the last 20, even more years. And I think in some ways they want these types of conversations to leave the margins of American public discourse. And so your continued work, engagement, advocacy, not only humanizes Afghans that are there, but hopefully continues this conversation space. And I want to thank Omar Aziz, and I know he'll come back on, but this symposium was not easy to put together in the matter of the time that they did. So thank you for this platform and for bringing this conversation into the academic spaces. We need more of this, and hopefully it's just the beginning of these types of conversations. And I believe they're going to share your contact information for anyone who's interested in engaging more, to learn from both of you. I know I've personally benefited and learned. I see you both as have been teachers in my life. And so I thank you for sharing your time with the audience here today. And Omar, I don't know if you had any remarks before we wrap up as well. I wanted to invite you back for a moment.
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for spending this time tonight to speak with us. I know those of us in California, it's a little bit earlier, and for you all, it's much later. So thank you for staying up for us. But we just learned so much, and I think this conversation just was really important in helping us to remember just the like we talked about, just the varied experiences that folks are bringing from Afghanistan. And one of the things we really wanted to do in this symposium is really center the voices of the people of Afghanistan and talk to people who have heard and directly worked with them, and make sure that was something that was uplifted through this week. So thank you all again for taking the time tonight to speak with us. I want to make sure, folks, if you have your social media for our panelists, to feel free to share that on your, and we can put that on YouTube as well. I want to thank Ali Sadat, who is not on screen right now, but who has been working alongside us to make sure that everything is running smoothly with technical support for the symposium for the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies Department at University of UC Riverside. And I also want to just make sure you all tune in again tomorrow. So we've kind of This is our third day of the symposium, and tomorrow will be our last day, and we'll sort of transition into more specifically the diaspora and looking at and understanding better sort of the context that many of the folks who are most recently left Afghanistan, and especially those that have come to the United States, sort of what is sort of the landscape they're entering, what does the Afghan American diaspora look like, and then exploring sort of what might be some of those challenges that exist for folks that are coming in, and also looking at some of the efforts that are being made to help support them in their transition and in their journeys from Afghanistan to the US. So we want to thank everybody who's joined us this week and who's been part of the discussions, and please make sure you're commenting, liking, subscribing on YouTube to keep track of all these events, to be in touch for future ones. And then we also wanted to remind you all to check out our fundraising campaign, where we are going to raise funds to support scholars who are going to be coming from Afghanistan to UC Riverside and supporting their transition to the United States, and supporting any efforts to make sure that they have what they need to be able to study and live here as comfortably as possible. So please we want to encourage you all to take a look at that crowdfunding campaign, to share it widely. Use our hashtags AFGUCR and AFG Symposium to look at some previous, to look at some of the quotes and hear about what some of the other panelists have said in the past few days. So once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and for getting through our third day of the symposium. And then we will see you all tomorrow at 12 o'clock for our keynotes with Dr. Iman Ahmad Sediqe, and then our evening panel. So please be sure to tune in. You don't want to miss it. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Have a good night, and thank you, everyone.